So do you,
Welcome. It's so great to see our visitors here. Welcome to our November edition of the Canadian Percussion Network 2021-2022. We have something unusual tonight. We have not one, but two guests to talk about a range of issues stemming with not only exploring different corners of the percussive arts world and the sound world, but also what we can do going beyond the percussive arts, which I think will be some fascinating discussion. So for, as you might know from folks who've watched other videos, we're doing a series of essentially monthly programming here, allowing a space for percussionists to talk about some issues that we normally don't get a chance to explore when all the concerts and everything are in full season. Fabrice and I are very pleased to let everyone know that this has led to a Shirk Connections grant where we're going to have an actual in-person event in April of 2022, where we have artists from all over Canada coming to play and talk about their percussion-focused research. And I think it'll be a really wonderful extension and step forward for this network. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Fabrice to introduce our guest for the evening.
Thank you, Mike. So tonight we have our two presenters, and I had the pleasure to have both of them as students at some point in my career. So we'll start with Krystina Marcoux, and Krystina is from Quebec. She studied percussion and she was at the Conservatory of Gatineau, close to Ottawa, but on the Quebec side of the river. Then she did her bachelor over there, came for artist diploma and master's at McGill, and decided to go to France to the Conservatory of Lyon for a doctorate, where she worked with Jean Geoffroy. And Krystina has been always interested by theater, and her final recital at McGill was an incredible staging of many new pieces, new works with theater. And then she kept doing that. She has lots of experience with acting. She did also the École de l'Humour, in fact. She did also some mime and lots of training in staging and acting. And then she really dived into the topic over her 3 or 4 years actually in Lyon with Jean Geoffroy. That many? Okay.
7 years.
Time flies.
Actually.
And then so she put 3 different recitals, and she will explain the different aspects of her research. And she was doing this doctorate à la French, where you have to do the 3 recital and the entire PhD and the 400 pages thesis. So that was quite an adventure, and I had the pleasure to read that. So she has lots and lots of things to share. That's for Krystina. And our second guest is Noam. And so Noam is from Ontario, and I had the pleasure to meet Noam years and years ago when he came for his bachelor at McGill. Then he went to the Conservatory of Paris to do a double masters in performance percussion and masters in chamber music. Then he came back to McGill for his doctorate studies with Ayun Huang and myself. And we collaborated for a while. Noam was in Six Drum Percussion Ensemble, and now is one of the members of Architect that he actually founded when he was still a student. The very first version of the quartet Architect, which is based in Montreal, was with Noam and colleagues. And years later, Noam is back to Architect. He's also very active with his duet, sax percussion duet called Scapegoat. And he's also artistic director of No Hey Banda, which is a collective putting together lots of very, very interesting works of arts which are beyond percussion, beyond the norm, I would say. And he will probably be able to explain and go in this direction a bit further. So I think we will start maybe with Krystina for the first question. And Krystina, I think I will ask you simply, maybe can you, in a nutshell, summarize what is musical theater? And I know it's a very vast topic, but if you could give us just a brief summary of what it is and what you think it is so that we can go to spectacle vivant, which is kind of another way of looking at it.
Exactly. So basically where it comes from and how it evolved eventually becomes spectacle vivant, especially in France. So coming out of Second World War, we have to imagine that arts in general, between the wars and after the Second World War, arts in general were really considering what they could do, how they could have a new way of expressing themselves. And the body became a really important part in all of this questioning and how arts could come together. And that's, in a very summarized way, how theater and music really tried to find a way to work together. And then you have really important composers. If we're really going to take everything from the musical aspect, because there's also the same path happened from the theater world where music came in, but from the music world, when the theater was brought into the scores, it was thanks to composers who really started working or with actors or with musicians that they would ask specifically to do some like really specific movements or some staging, sometimes really simple staging. And this is all in the same time where movements like Fluxus in the States were coming along and people were really trying to break the boundaries. And a really good way of doing that was A, musically reconsidering everything, and B, by breaking the fourth wall and bringing the musicians in movement. And when we talk about musical theater in that sense, which would be kind of more instrumental theater, if we could say, which in French is théâtre instrumental, it's really when the performer, the musician, is asked gestures. More than theater itself, it's a way of gestures or speech, but you don't usually reach embodying a character. That comes a lot later. That comes more in spectacle vivant. It's the era of Kagel, for example, or of Fluxus, where really we're going to ask you really specific movements to try and really see how far we can go in the spectrum of how music can be brought further and how the gesture can really be brought in the music. I think that's the shortest I can do for this very broad question.
Thank you. And so, how did you get into musical theater? Where, but often it's through Kaggle or there's kind of composer that we do our first steps. For you, what was the path?
For me, it was kind of the same, except when I was, this is very personal, but back when I was doing my bachelor's in Gatineau, I remember thinking, this is not very nice, but thinking that percussionists usually look really bad on stage and that the physicality of it can really help you, but it can also be very negative. If you don't move properly, I'm not saying exaggerated theatrical things, just like the way the body is actually activating the sound, there's something really strange about it. And even as an audience member, which is very different if you're listening to CD, obviously, but when you see a performer that looks really uncomfortable on stage, it used to really shock me when I was back my bachelor's, this a long time ago. And then when I got to McGill, I discovered, mainly through Ayun, all this crazy world of instrumental theater. And the first piece I worked on was Corps à Corps. Well, I started by trying to learn to play Zarb for like 2 years and then digged into this piece, which opened this huge panorama of works and of all of these things that were invented. I also worked on Kaggle, obviously. We did Prison Song together. I don't know if you remember that. So the way I did was kind of conventional in that sense. I started with really these important percussion pieces, because percussion was a very important instrument, obviously, in instrumental theater. And from that, I grew out of it to go into spectacle vivant, but that happened more in France, actually.
Thank you. And I know that Noam, you also did some of those pieces. But so how did it start for you, and how from there you went to maybe a different direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably started kind of in a similar way to Krystina, where when I was in my undergrad, I saw Dressure played at McGill back during that time. And I was like, oh my God, that's super cool. I'd like to do that someday. But I didn't do very much like instrumental theater at the beginning, I don't think. And I mean, I think when I played Dressure, that's the first time I really got into kind of the detail of instrumental theater. But I never kind of went into the direction of, I then want to go kind of further into the theatrical world from there. I kind of went into the direction of what is the extension on the kind of percussion side of things, or as a percussionist, how can that be extended in other ways, which in some cases has included kind of gesture or theater, but kind of more in that kind of like, here is an instruction that we're going to give to these musicians because musicians are good at following instructions. So that's kind of in the theater side where that has evolved to, I guess, for me. And on the other hand, it's just been, I guess I've always been interested in kind of pushing further away from conventional approaches to percussion playing, whether it's by music I'm interested in or just kind of being pushed that way. Like when I was in Paris and I was the one person who kind of wanted to play contemporary music in the percussion class, and so I got kind of pushed into all those projects, and met people who then we would kind of discover stuff together, and kind of just went further and further, and from meeting people or discovering music that I wanted to play is where kind of these notions of a post-percussive practice, or where I felt that those notions could kind of help me understand my own practice.
So, same question as I asked to Krystina. In a nutshell, what do you define as your percussionist practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm gonna, just so I don't make any mistakes, I will read the description that I spent about like 4 years trying to define during my doctorate, which is one sentence. So a post-percussive practice abandons the fundamental concept of what is typically considered as percussion, making its original characteristics practically unrecognizable. And so for me with this, what I found that this really means is that I feel like in a lot of the stuff I do, I'm kind of starting from scratch every time I have a new piece to play. And so, so one of the pieces that's been kind of helped me understand that was this piece by Pierluigi Bilone for 2 singing bowls. And basically I found that, in a lot of the music I play, I do have to learn a technique from scratch in trying to play whatever instrument or object is asked for. And so while there definitely is stuff in my percussion training background that has helped me get to that point, it's not like my snare drum technique is really gonna influence the techniques that I use in any given piece. And so yeah, and that kind of helped me then understand for myself, kind of when I'm performing with electronics, how I could integrate those aspects into my practice in a similar way that I do kind of any less conventional percussion playing. So basically this idea of learning something from scratch every time you have to play a new piece or something along those lines.
Interesting. So hearing you talk about that here and in the video, it's interesting because it sounds almost, what is it? I'm losing the term, but to go as a percussionist to be talking about moving beyond percussion, heresy, that was what I was looking for, almost heretical. And then like my next thought after that was, it's also fascinating because in some ways that connects with very early percussion ensemble music, which was often written, particularly in the West Coast percussion ensemble composers, for people who were not percussionists. And so I thought it was both sort of the future and the past of percussion, maybe at the same time. And I was curious if there's an intersection of that in your thinking, or like, did that older approach to percussion inspire this, or it's really just something you've been interested in artistically in terms of moving beyond the limitations of the instrument?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've found that's been interesting is it kind of helped me understand like why I'm still a percussionist in a sense. Like I remember when I was kind of starting to go through these projects, there's always this question of, okay, why are you doing this? Like this isn't percussion. Why? But in fact, all of this to say that this is in fact percussion. And I guess it does. I mean, I wasn't thinking of this connects to like the earliest percussion ensemble, but in a way it does. And percussionists have always been given the other things to play. So what happens when those other things become the main thing, I guess. But being able to say like that, it's not like I'm a post-percussionist. No, I'm a percussionist, but that can just encompass so many more things than, you know, what we would kind of typically consider as, you know, picking up a stick or a mallet and hitting something.
Interesting. And so, Krystina, I was thinking of the connections there with you. Do you feel like you are a percussionist dabbling in these other forms of art, or that you're this sort of multi-artist who happens to speak in percussion?
Actually, it's very curious, and also hearing Noam talk about this, because I remember I'm going to do an aparté, and then I'm going to answer your question, Michael, because it's going to help me answer the question. What is spectacle vivant, because we didn't get to that with Fabrice, is, for me, this is a personal answer for my own parcours, but it can also, it relates to the genre. It's when you really try creating a show, all the art forms together, or the art forms you want to use together. So you'll do the staging, the music, the narration, if it's the case, the dancing, if it's the case, as one same thing. And all of the performers are going to work on all those aspects together while creating the show. So considering that, when I started working on Spectacle Vivant in France, I forgot that I was a percussionist. I forgot that I knew how to play. I forgot everything that I had ever actually, well, I didn't forget it, but it was like, I took it for granted. Because what was fun and new and exciting for me was to dance, for example, to have to do this choreography with a zarb for 20 minutes, where actually the playing, I would work on it later, you know, but always thinking I'm going to work on the percussion later, or on the notes, or on the music disappeared in a way, or it was very weak. So the thing that was supposed to be my strength and that would excuse my weakness in the other areas, because even though I have a background in all of these arts, I am not all of these arts. I'm not a super form dancer. I've done theater, but not the way an actor does. So I had all these weaknesses, but I would forget that music was the important part. So for me, it was kind of this curve where music kind of disappeared and then came back very strongly to really become the driving force in what I knew, which also really permits me to go further from it sometimes and then come back to it. And like even today, if we think about it, I do more music speak like in the sense of like the straight sense than I used to do back in France. So it's very curious how it can go. But yeah, it's definitely something in that sense. I think it's maybe very similar to Noam, where the parcours is not a straight line. It's really something where you kind of go this way, and eventually you find something that feels really comfortable for a while. And then, no, I'm going to go that way again, which is, I hope it's going to be like that when I'm 60, you know, because that means we're still always exploring and finding new ways or new paths.
And maybe I'll just add something to that. Maybe Krystina, also, that like you kind of had to set aside the music for a little bit to kind of reach that comfort level of the theatrical, to then be able to kind of integrate them at the same level. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
And so I know that both of you've been collaborating with composers, even though you know, like you're both going in different practices. And I know that some of them we always have, like, you know, people we meet have a strong importance. So maybe I will ask with you, Noam, because I remember the first time you played, for example, Billione's music, and then later on, I don't know how many pieces you've been playing from him now, and he actually wrote some for you. So can you explain this first encounter with the score, basically, and how it translates into meeting the person behind the score, and then the collaboration that brings you further?
Yeah. I mean, it started really kind of simply in that I think I don't know how I discovered his music. It was maybe through Christian Smith or Ryan Packard or someone from the kind of that crowd at McGill at some time. But when I was already in Paris, and basically it was playing. I think I was playing a show in Toronto, and I needed a solo piece, and I didn't have like many instruments that I could use back then in Toronto, and so there was this piece for two singing bowls, and I was like, oh, that's perfect. This music seems fascinating to me, and so I started learning it, and obviously it was a piece that's kind of easy to move around and play a lot, and eventually I went to Darmstadt, the summer academy in Germany, and where he was one of the composition faculty there. And I set up a lesson with him. I mean, he's very approachable by email, but I set up a lesson with him. And I guess I played it well enough that he took a liking to my interpretation, and we kind of stayed in touch after that. I ended up playing another solo of his, Money DK, which was for a slightly bigger setup. It has two plate bells and a Thai gong, and an opera gong around the performer's chest. And throughout, I would be sending, I would kind of send him videos of performances or rehearsals to get his feedback. And then eventually we commissioned him with my saxophone and percussion duo Scapegoat. We commissioned him to write a saxophone and percussion piece, which we performed quite a few times and then recorded, and then so he wrote me a solo a couple of years back, and that was kind of out of the blue, honestly. He emailed me one day and he said, hey, I'm writing a new percussion solo, like I have you in mind, do you want to play? Do you want it, basically? And I said, of course. And then he was like, okay, I'm going to confirm in a couple of days. I need to make sure that my idea is it's going to work. A couple of days later, we write back. He's like, yes, it's going to work. Like, I can probably send you a score in 8 months or something. And 4 months later, he was basically like, hey, the score is ready. And that was honestly the most challenging piece I think I've ever played. It became like a pandemic project just because of how things lined up. But it was really kind of in a different, to me, felt like a different level than his previous works. So
what I find interesting, what is interesting with Bidone is I think you have to be a percussionist to be able to play those pieces, because so the techniques are almost all new, and it's so precise, so detailed. I'm just thinking about the first one, Maniconche, which is like 2 balls, and you have, I don't know, maybe 25 different techniques to strike and rub the balls and to create sounds. Mm-hmm. And the other pieces are in the same way. So every object that is using has I don't know how many things. So the score is very detailed. And my question is is it through this approach that you're using the same techniques of trying everything possible on any object when you're working on other pieces? So are you basically, is your process to apply this kind of approach, trying everything, or are you trying to get first information from the composer to go in that direction? How do you?
I think it's. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's more actually, and even in Bilone's case, it's more about getting the information from the composer about what each technique is and how it's supposed to sound, rather than trying to discover every sound and then use it in the context of the piece. And I think that's what really kind of gives the work a really clear structure and kind of déroulement, is that it's not like a catalog of everything that can be done, but it's this very specific set of basically a language of techniques and sounds that's used in this piece. And so for me, and I try to apply a similar approach in other contexts. It's really about, kind of mastering, for lack of a better term, those sounds and those techniques to be able to transmit the piece, or kind of satisfy the requirements of the piece.
And just to go on that, what is it that you find so interesting in the pieces, in the works you're doing, that you didn't quit playing percussion, but you do lots of work which are like outside of what you've been training for a long time? And so what is the catch for you? What's interesting for you there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think often it's the sound world, which just has so much. It's not about being better or worse or anything. It's just that so much potential in those sounds, and I've always liked this idea. I think like Delaunay speaks of this somewhere in his writings or in one of his talks of by like, it feels like as if you're like zooming into a sound, so kind of zooming into this like a specific of a sound, and within that, by doing so, you can then differentiate better kind of all the little tiny details within that sound. And so I feel by kind of diving into these worlds or these sound worlds, it's opening up the possibility of everything that's within them. So I don't know if that makes sense. But so if we kind of go into like the more noise-based world, for example, all of a sudden it's not like you have kind of a relatively harmonic or melodic work that all of has this noise in it. This noise becomes this framework within which you can then have all these other sounds emerge from.
Okay, thank you. So it's like the challenge is the coherence of building the coherence of the musical discourse there. And I'm wondering, Krystina, that's kind of the same, because here you're adding different layers of meaning. You're adding text, you're adding choreography or acting, and how do you approach that? Because it's a lot to put together and to kind of manage at the same time, and be able to work on, because it's very different from the training of a musician.
Yeah, it goes in the exact opposite direction of the training of the musician, if we could say. Well, even what Noam is saying is very far from what we learn at school. I think there's a lot of different methodologies for trying to put together all of these different art forms together. One thing I've learned just through doing it is the importance of accepting that each art form will have its place and its role on stage, and we'll talk about a show or a piece, whichever, and it's very hard to have them on the same level. So some moments, it's really kind of this wave where sometimes the music is going to be the most important art form, and whatever other one is there, I'll take kind of a background role, and then it'll change. It'll be the movements, the gestures, then it can be the text. Text usually tends to be the art form that goes over everyone, because the fact that the audience understands text, they grasp onto that. Sorry for the I'm showing this, but that's something that's always a big challenge with text. There are many ways to go around that, but usually you have to be really careful to that. You have to know it. That text tends to be really frontal. And then on that, it's also trying to find out you as a performer, and this is a personal obsession, but I'm really obsessed about what the audience is perceiving of what I'm doing or what's going on stage. Not necessarily saying I want them to think what I'm thinking or to feel what I'm feeling, but I want to give something or to bring something really in some directions. So considering all of this, which art form do I want to work on the most, and which way, and which one is going to guide me in this section. So let's say that the gesture is the most important. How can I bring the music to live for the gesture? If I really want the music to be the driving element, how can the text be secondary to that and really drive this? So this is a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of testing, a lot of feedback from friends, because you don't usually have the budget to pay a stage director for 3 months like they do in theater. And this back and forth and learning your own methodology is extremely important, I feel, or I felt, in putting on productions or really larger pieces that have all these elements. And even in pieces that exist, if you take one that's really known like Corps à Corps, you do need to ask yourself these questions. Is the text going to drive me here? Is the zarb going to drive me here? Which one do I want? At what moment do I care to really get the detail in all the diction that we can get into these moments? Do I want the zarb to really be the one that's dictating and the voice only a second layer repeating? So these are questions you have to ask yourself the same way that if you're learning Beethoven, you wonder how phrasing is important, or which line in the string quartet is going to be the one that's driving force. So it does relate to what we learn, but it also goes a lot further. And then barriers are very important to try and find where's your comfort zone and to what extent you want to push out of it. And from that, how do you work considering those elements?
Okay, thanks. So you in your doctorate you took like some examples of very famous composers working in those directions, like of course Apergis and also Thierry Demey, and so the Belgian composer and Apergis, a French composer, both of them having actually totally different approaches to this relationship between music and theater, to put it broadly, but also. You've been working more recently with Jean-Pierre Drouet, with this French percussionist and composer, which was like super well known on the other side of the pond. But in North America, Jean-Pierre is not very well known, despite the fact that he has been like one of the key persons to develop this genre, actually, and mostly in France. And as a composer, he composed lots of pieces that do integrate movements, voice while you're playing. So maybe, Krystina, you can describe a little bit your work with Jean-Pierre, because you're working with him right now, if I'm right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am working with Jean-Pierre right now. It's extremely surprising how, yes, unknown actually he is on this side of the ocean, which is kind of also what in a way pushed me to say, like, okay, this work needs to be done, or the cross really needs to happen, because I met Jean-Pierre through Apergis. So like you're saying, in my doctoral thesis, I was working on not the works by Apergis that we all know, but all the shows by Apergis, because he wrote these shows in a collaborative and a collective way back in the 80s until early 90s, where they would all get together in a room and write something all together. So the question of who's the actual composer is also a question here, but that's another topic. And I met Drouet, actually not even because I wanted to meet him as a percussionist, because I was coming from this, like, I'm putting myself really like on the spot here. I barely knew anything about Jean-Pierre when I got to France. And I wanted to see the machines, because they would create these huge musical machines. And it was Jean-Pierre's wife that built these machines. She was an architect and then worked in the theater world. So she would build all these machines, and I cared about that. That's how I met Jean-Pierre, and I was like, oh my God, this world open and everything, and all the collaborations, because I met him through theater, but he worked with Berio, with Stockhausen, with Kagel, with Xenakis, all the greatest composers, that percussionists we all study like in depth. he worked with them on all these famous pieces. And so my work now with him actually consists more of understanding the performance practice of how he worked with those composers. So we're actually not specifically in the theater world. It's more like how, well, most of the pieces, because Trio Le Cercle, which is the trio that they had for many, many years, ended up kind of specializing just, he says it's just, that's how it happened, kind of casually, but they ended up specializing into instrumental theater. And we're really digging into the pieces themselves. Like, for example, Julien, that's why I was asking Alexandre how it went, played Touché for his recital last week. So we worked on Touché together. And then I called Jean-Pierre and was like, okay, we've already worked on this piece together, but here are the list of new questions I have for you. And what are the answers that Vinko Globokar actually gave you back in the day? Why did you do it that way? What were you considering? What did both of you think? So that we know where we're coming from, because it's really fun to know what we do today. But to me, the context and understanding the past is something that is an obsession of mine, knowing where we come from to be able to move forward. So it's really this idea of being, okay, this is how the performance practice was done back in the day. He's worked with so many great people, and this information to me is so precious that we really need to have it while he's still around. So it's really trying to get all this information. I need to, at some point, write all this information. Now I have like 45 hours of interview. I have to take the time at some point to put it all down. But it's precious. It's something so incredible. Like, every collaboration he's done are so great. And he already wrote me, he also wrote me a piece a couple of years ago that we're going to be recording in, if COVID permits, in April, next April, where it's for him and me. So it's kind of funny. And he wrote it considering his age and his slow speed. So it's all of the, like, I'm playing more and more crazy things and he's just getting slower and slower. So it's all of the, it's very theatrical because he wanted to go in that direction, probably because of me also. But yeah, so that's specifically the work I'm doing with Jean-Pierre right now.
Thank you. And it's interesting because it brings us to the question of the documentation of what you do. And this is this kind of interesting world where we are documenting more and more things that have not much value. Our phones are full of pictures that have not much interest for the long term. But we're collaborating with composers, and we do pieces with electronics and this theater and objects that are very specific and that can only be developed basically with the composers themselves. And then if someone else wants to play the piece, the score or whatever trace that is published is not enough, and you have to go to the primary source to learn about it. So that would be a question for Noam, I think, because you're creating lots of new pieces, but you're also putting together lots of pieces like with yourself, with No High Banda, with Architect, that are already existing, but you're the second or the third performer. How do you go about that? And knowing that, how do you proceed for new pieces? Do you think about the documentation?
Yeah, I don't think I don't really think about the documentation. Just to answer that second part of the question quickly. But in terms of, I'll answer the first part first, and maybe we'll get to the second part again afterwards. But I think in almost every case, we try and contact the composer. And it's just, I mean, almost everything we play, the composers, in whether it's solo stuff or with any of my groups, the composers alive. One thing I found is that, I mean, people, especially kind of when we were in kind of undergrad masters, we view composers as just like, oh my God, these famous people are going to be impossible to get in touch with. But people are so approachable in general. And especially these composers, you know, kind of working on maybe the fringes of more established genres or music. They are really excited when you get in touch with them to perform their works. And so I found that they're usually there to help. and kind of guide you if necessary through the gear or equipment or whatever is needed for that to happen. I've found that, I mean, in a lot of like the more tech stuff that I do, one of the things that kind of just emerged from the people I was working with was mostly the use of like pretty basic technical equipment. So which is pretty easy to find. And I think that does kind of break down some barriers in terms of those pieces being able to live on. Of course, then you get to the problem of certain devices going obsolete. But I mean, I think there are ways around that eventually that are possible to find. But in general, there's never been this goal of trying to make things difficult to ever perform again. I don't know if there's really been the goal of trying to make them easier, but it's but you know, with my duo, we always wanted to be able to tour stuff, and so we didn't want huge setups. Obviously, once you like add one more pedal or one more microphone or one more instrument, it grows really quickly. But I think that we've tried to keep stuff relatively contained.
Thanks.
So it's been fascinating just being a fly on the wall and getting to hear this dialogue. And I'm struck by the fact that you guys all share something in common that's different from me, and that's you spent time as musicians in France. And so I was curious for both of our guests, how that time over there shaped your interest in your art form and things you learned that you've brought back to this side of the pond.
You can answer first, Krystina.
You're not on mute, so you can answer first, because I know we have very different answers on that.
For me, I think that the like most positive thing of being in France was the people I met, and some of them were, well, most of them were through the Conservatoire where I was studying, but also kind of from those people meeting others. I mean, I did have a kind of a hard time at some moments at the Conservatoire for various reasons. But when, I mean, it's just really, it's a whole different world there in terms of the approach to kind of performance and training, and people start at such a young age. So the kind of base level is so high. And I think what I found was that when I moved there, there were some music that I was interested in, and I found that I got there and that music was sometimes treated as more of an etude or kind of training study, and less as a performance work. And that's kind of what, I think that's one of the things that pushed me towards trying to find different approaches, because that stuff that I thought I was interested in all of a sudden was kind of sterile in approach. But yeah, I met wonderful people, and I wouldn't be doing what I was doing if I hadn't been there. And yeah, I worked with wonderful musicians that are really kind of found that they're really game to try a lot of things, even if at first glance you might think that, oh no, they're never gonna like dance flamenco on stage, but but once they're given the instruction to, they will do it and be really good at it.
So you found some of the repertoire that you were interested in here was considered more of just sort of stepping stone over there?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so Krystina, it sounds like you had a very different experience. What was yours?
I think the school here has a big role to play, and Noam, I don't know what's your thought about this, but Noam went to Paris and I went to Lyon. So I think, and we were there at the same time. Well, we overlapped. We got there a year before and I got there right after. So we would see each other and kind of sorry if I say this, bitch against the system together. This
We
would
had
happen
to be friends in some way or another.
exactly. That's the thing. If not, we were too weird. And we would actually see each other a lot more when we lived in two different cities than we do now that we live both in Montreal. And but definitely in Lyon, it's changed now because the faculty has changed again. But with Jean, I actually went exactly where I needed to be in that sense, because he's amazing in anything that's just music. His approach, his pedagogy, you guys know what I mean, was really what I was looking for at that moment. So in that sense, it was like, okay, sweet. The guidance was really, really good, which didn't work like that for everyone, because he has a really strong personality, also very strong approach. So you have to find your way through the guidance, if we could say. And also Lyon had very close ties with dance, because there's an amazing dance school that's attached to it's the same Conservatoire Supérieur, but it's across the river. So that also opened something which for me was great. And the school at that point was really focusing on trying to open that, to be able to like be as far as possible to Paris. It was kind of this way that we're going to be different also by doing all of these multidisciplinary works and stuff. So in that sense, it was different. And I also managed, I think, being there as a doctoral student, to kind of do what I wanted in a way, and to get things also by learning just by seeing. Like Noam was saying, the level is really, really, really high. And what I thought was amazing back in my master's of theater and music and dance and all this, I got there, I was like, okay, wow, we're talking about something else. It's like we can go that far and it seems normal, and breaking all these boundaries, these barriers. It was actually for me really great. There's a lot of other sides, which I'm not going to get into. It's not simple to live in France, mainly as a woman, for example. It's not always easy, but those are other things that you don't necessarily have to deal. Well, yes, you deal with them every day, but they're not musically always a frame. They can be, but not always. But so yeah, my experience overall was great, but I did come back also. So it does say something too. Sorry, Fabrice.
No, it's I'm here too.
Yeah.
I came one day and never left. So yeah. It's been 16 years now.
I went to a conference in France and it seemed lovely, but yeah, that's a different experience.
Definitely, yeah, and like I love going back. Like the duo I have with cello, we spend like the next 2 years are going to be 4 or 5 months in France each year. So the market is crazy, it's amazing, and the audience is great. They know it. Like you play for people, and it's not that they've heard the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven once in their life. No, they know music. So that's also great. The sharing on the day-to-day basis, you talk to someone in the streets you've never met, they're actually going to know about culture. The cultural level in general is really high, or compared to I'll say Quebec in this here. So that feels good. You feel like what you do actually is valued. That's, for me, it was huge. It was a really big and fun thing to have the experience, to live as an experience.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
I have maybe a last question because time flies. And it's related to that. So coming back to Montreal in Quebec and being young professionals now, because you were like for a long time of your life in schools, and where we have access to instruments, we have access to resources of some sort. And now you're on your own and you have to make a living with that. And so I'm wondering how much of the passion you have to go in those different, post-percussive or extended percussive way, how much of that you're able to sustain? Is it the major part of your income or your work, and how does it work for you? How do you manage to become professional musicians who are not teachers in faculties in conservatoire or in academia? And so how is it? And is it doable? Because we have like young students who will watch this video and be wondering, wow, that sounds really interesting. And then can I make a living with that? So maybe, I don't know, Noam, you want to start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a lot of like self-developed and self-produced projects between Architect or Noah Banda or scapegoat, which has been a bit on a pause because of the pandemic, but with hopefully stuff coming up or solo stuff. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to pursue kind of like my artistic interests through those projects. But it does mean a lot of admin work. You know, it's not like getting called for gigs regularly, or at all. So it's kind of, I mean, yes, when the grant money comes in, it's great, and stuff can be done with a budget and you can get paid for it. But it's a very kind of short-term, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm drawing a blank.
Projection, or like, yeah, la projection, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's not like I have this thing going. I mean, some projects obviously can be longer term, but you know, if a grant doesn't come in, then all of a sudden you're pivoting and trying to find another way to make it happen.
So basically, you are creating your projects, and you are actually the one going to finance the project through grants and applications.
That's right.
So
yeah.
All of your your writing work in your academia is paying now.
Right, hopefully.
All right, thank you. And Krystina, what about you?
I think that's something that students really need to hear. What Noam just said, Canada is a gold mine, sorry, it's that way around. Grants here are absolutely incredible, and there is really a space and a way to create and to like artistically search, and to not just play because you need to pay the bills. That is something that's really incredible in Canada, and right now they're being particularly generous, or that's what I've seen here post-pandemic. So that's something I think for students. Yes, it's important to know how to write. Yes, it's important to know how to figure out a project completely, whatever you like, just to be able to see the big picture, because it's something that really exists, at least for the moment. We're still in a liberal government for a while, so we're good for a little period again. On my end, that was my little bubble moment. But my major project is actually not in theater or multidisciplinary. Well, I do some multidisciplinary work with Stick and Bow, but with Stick and Bow, it's a big chunk of my work as a musician, what pays the bills, what really keeps us rolling. So it's cello and marimba mainly, also a bit of percussion there. So that's really what I've been working on in Canada, which has started before I was back in Canada. I also came back a bit with the pandemic. That was a big like, whew, okay, back in Canada, because I preferred being here when it all went to poops. And it's been great because we could have just worked together. The question you also asked, Fabrice, about studios, if you're in Montreal, it's definitely a huge issue. If you're not in Montreal, it's maybe a bit easier, but definitely once you're out of school, getting access to instruments, like I have to think twice before I do a project with 1,000 drums, because where are you going to rehearse something with 1,000 drums? Because your neighbors already hate you when you play anything. So it's definitely something you think differently once you're outside of school, sadly, because sometimes you really want to do these projects with all these things, but you can't, or you have to find a huge grant so you can rent a big space, and a lot of money goes to just the rental. So there's a lot of questioning that comes, the logistics about being a professional percussionist in a non-academia or like stable job. I think that's what me and Noam do, definitely come with some disadvantage, but also we have to be creative. We have to find a way around it, which probably explains also some of a part of your research in a way, Noam, or while you're also maybe continuing in that direction. For me, it's been also, now I think I want to really get back to just putting productions together, because I haven't done it since I've been back to Canada. Also a space issue, definitely.
Maybe add,
Mike.
Wonderful. That was on purpose. That was my theatrical performance. So this has been wonderfully enlightening. I've learned so much from both of you. So thank you. We've never done this duo guest before, but I think it works out quite well. Believe it or not, we are pretty much at the end of our time here. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing your content with us and all your background and insights, and look forward to checking out more of this stuff in the future. So just as we wrap up here, I wanted to mention we have our next event scheduled, actually features our co-leader of the network here, Fabrice Mirandola, where we have a fantastic project where his group Six Drum is collaborating with a Toronto-based percussion ensemble focused on gamelan music, and they're going to give a behind-the-scenes tour of how this piece comes together. And so I thought he will give a pitch here about that event, which will be scheduled at some point early next year. We're still working out some of the dates. And I believe there's a concert coming up in Toronto on, is it the 27th of November?
Yes, so we have actually a concert in Montreal next Wednesday, next week, 24th, and then 2 concerts in Toronto, 27th, 28th. So if you're around, please don't hesitate to come. So it's a project with the Gamelan Evergreen Club Contemporary Gamelan, which is directed by Blair McKay, and with a bunch of percussionists basically in this gamelan, and also a few other instrumentalists. And so it will be around 4 new works composed for this huge ensemble of 14 musicians, almost like 14 percussionists. So it's quite large. And so we will have this session will be with Mark Duggan. Mark is one of the, I think he's one of the founding members of the gamelan, and he's also a composer, percussionist, very active around in the Toronto area. And Mark has been, he said it was an orchestration, with way more than an orchestration of a piece that was written for the gamelan a while ago by Alain Thibault. And it's a rewriting of the piece now with the 2 ensembles together, and that will be kind of a starting point to kind of decode what it means to write for percussion, what it means to write for percussion and a gamelan, which is percussion based but coming from another culture, what it means for an ensemble of this sort in Toronto to play an instrument, to create new music with an instrument or orchestra which is idiomatic of another culture. And all of those questions around, and of course we'll speak about the other composers who are doing like very interestingly, very 4 different approaches to this to ensemble. So we will record the interview with Mark and Blair next week. We'll have a bunch of examples also that we will bring together there, and so it'll be the base of the videos. And of course we'll have a session where we can dig into all of these aspects. And I really want also to get from Mark his experience as a percussionist, writing for percussionists, writing percussion music, not only, but how that is informing actually his way of writing for percussion. So that's next in sometimes January or February. We're not totally sure yet with Mike.
Early 2022. That'll be fantastic. So yeah, we have just a couple more virtual events leading up to our big in-person gathering at the end of April. So we'll shortly be sending out information about that. And we will have, as part of that event, a call for posters and a call for performances. So anyone engaged in percussion research that's interested in sharing their work is to be a fantastic venue for that. Fabrice and I will also be talking about some basic approaches to doing percussion research, and we're going to have some amazing performances from artists from all across Canada. There'll also be a call for performances for a Friday evening concert, where if people would like to do a research project related to their performance, you might be able to do both, or even just do the performing. So I think it'll be a great couple of days, and we're all looking forward to being able to gather in person. So thank you so much for your attention tonight, and we will post this to our Facebook group page shortly. Take care, everyone. Thanks again, speakers.
Thank you, Krystina. Thank you, Noam.
Hey,
Thank you.
thanks.